My name is Micheál Ledwith. Micheál is the Irish language form of Michael. I enrolled as a student for the Catholic priesthood in 1960 at Maynooth College in Ireland, which was the major seminary for the whole of Ireland, as well as being a college of the National University of Ireland and a pontifical university. A pontifical university is a university which has its charter from the Pope, which is the way most of the original and ancient universities in Europe began. I was born in County Wexford in Ireland in 1942. And I was, like many young men of my time, who were idealistic and who wanted to find the answers to the great questions about life and human destiny, the questions that perplexed everyone, even agnostics and atheists. And I set out to find in the best way available to me at that time what the answers to those questions might be. And that's how I began my search in earnest in 1960. I began to study for a degree of Bachelor of Arts of the National University of Ireland. Then I obtained a Bachelor of Philosophy degree at the Pontifical University in Maynooth. Now, I was very fortunate at that time in my life to have had a very rare privilege, and that was the chance to spend a long time without interruption at the study of various subjects: physics, chemistry, law, history, literature, as well as my main studies of interest in philosophy and theology. And after several bachelor's and licentiate degrees, I culminated my 11 or 12 years of university-level study with a doctorate in theology. I was appointed onto the staff of the university almost immediately as a lecturer. And 4 or 5 years later, I became a professor of dogmatic or systematic theology. Then subsequently, I became Dean of the Faculty, Head of Department, Registrar of the University, and finally Vice President in 1980. 5 years later, I was appointed President of Maynooth College for a 10-year term, which I completed in 1994. Now, in 1980, a very significant thing occurred. I was appointed a member of a small elite group of theologians from all over the world called the International Theological Commission. It was charged with advising the Holy See and the Pope on theological matters. And I was to occupy that position for 3 separate terms, totaling 17 years in all. I took that position very seriously. And for almost all of that time, the head of the commission was the present Pope, Benedict XVI, who was then Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. I was very conscious that the Pope we were advising, Pope John Paul II, had an enormous responsibility. More than 1 billion Catholics in the world hung on his every word. And his word was also deeply respected by many other religious groups, Christian and non-Christian. But I still found, despite the fact that some of the most legendary theologians of my student days served with me on that International Commission, they were men of incredible learning, unbelievable knowledge, famed in their field all across the world. But despite the fact that I had access on a daily basis to them, despite the fact that I had opened to me the best libraries in the universities of Europe and the best religious libraries all over Europe and elsewhere, including the Vatican libraries, there were still those gaps remaining, which showed me that the Jesus of history was not the Jesus that I saw hidden behind so many of the statements in the Gospels. And obviously, I was deeply perturbed by that. Now, one statement in particular perturbed me most of all. Jesus said in the Gospel of St. John that if we followed his teachings, that we would do all the works, by which St. John mentioned miracles. We would do all the works that Jesus did, and greater than these would we do. Now, the point is valid, even if Jesus only spoke of one miracle. We should all be able to do at least one miracle if we follow his teachings. But when I looked around me at the 20,000 churches and denominations that carry the Christian label today, where is the evidence that this is taking place? Indeed, when I look outside of Christianity, I'm driven to the conclusion from my own personal research that none of the major religions have ever lived up to the promises that their founders made. Now, this was a really serious situation for me. And I felt, coming as an intensely devoted son of the Christian tradition, that there was a dire need for a deeper examination of what Jesus was and what Jesus did than was commonly retailed from the lecture hall and the pulpits all across the Christian world. Now, given the roles that I have had and the positions I have held, I suppose it's laboring the obvious to say that not everyone is happy with the things I am saying and the things I am doing now. But those teachings of Ramtha gave a new direction and depth to a lifetime that I had dedicated to the study of these questions. And they guided me into unfamiliar and exciting channels. It endowed my entire life and understanding with a depth and a meaning which they would otherwise never have had. Now, when you look at the four Gospels of the New Testament, the canonical New Testament, and also some of the other Gospels that never made it into the New Testament for obvious reasons, as we will see later. When you do that, I suppose the first thing that a sincere seeker will notice is that we hear of Jesus being born at Bethlehem, which covers a couple of days of his life. We hear that shepherds, the outcasts of Jewish society, come to visit him. We hear of the Magi coming to do him honor. The two most despised classes in the mind of an Orthodox Jew, for the Magi were Babylonian astrologers, which every God-fearing Jew would abhor and shun. Let's take baptism. First sacrament of the Christian Church, which it is. But this is a very ancient ceremony. It goes back thousands upon thousands of years in the mists of antiquity. And it's based on the belief that water was the primeval substance from which everything else came. I suppose scientifically today we have to acknowledge that that's not far off the mark. So in this ceremony, after your instruction and preparation, you were brought to a pool of water and you were submerged in the water. What did that symbolize? It symbolized, in our modern terms, that you were being recycled, that you were going back into the primeval substance, water, from which you had originally emerged, and then you were raised up, and you were going to be raised up to an entirely new level of life. This is what the born-again Christians have at the root of their belief. It's an entirely new form of life that's symbolized in this ritual. Let's take another major Christian element. Ask, where did that come from? The sacred meal of the Eucharist, the Last Supper, which Jesus ate with his disciples in the upper room on the night before he was arrested. This ceremony also goes back thousands upon thousands of years to the great mystery schools. And the elements that are in the Eucharist symbolize the deepest elements about human nature and its potentials for you and me. In the ancient schools, the element of that meal were very, very sacred. The wine symbolized the Spirit, which came directly from the Creator. The bread symbolized the body of the physical incarnation. And the water which was added to the wine symbolized the soul, which was the recorder of the experiences of the incarnation. Now here we're back again to our old friend quantum physics. We know from quantum physics that whatever we accept and believe truly, deeply and profoundly, and what we focus on, we know that that's going to be magnetized into our life, infallibly. The Eucharist, or this sacred meal of the bread and wine and water, was the profound ceremony destined to unify this spirit, this soul and this body, and to transmute it exactly as Jesus taught. All of the 7 sacraments, in fact, were profound rites of initiation in the ways in which they were first performed. Are they ever performed in this way now? Unfortunately, almost never. Because the focus is most likely to be far too much on getting the parking lot emptied of cars from the first congregation before the next congregation arrives for the following Mass or religious service. Now let's take another example, the cross itself. The cross has now become identified with Christianity. It's the very symbol of Jesus himself today. But of course the cross is far more ancient than Christianity. It was part of the tradition of the mystery schools. What did it symbolize at that time? It symbolized the harmony of the vertical and the horizontal, of the transcendent with the immanent, of the realms beyond with the realms here and now on this plane. The symbol of the crucifix in traditional Christianity, and remember the crucifix is not the cross. The crucifix recalls the passion and the death of Jesus. It was not by any means at the heart of what he was about. So, why have we come to venerate this symbol of an agonizing death? Venerating the crucifix is the same thing as if we today venerated an electric chair as a symbol of execution, placing its representation on our altars or hanging it on chains around our neck. One of the most favored titles the Christian tradition gave to Jesus was Lion of the tribe of Judah. It was the Emperor Justinian II who decreed only in the year 692 that the crucifix should replace the bare cross, which was in fact a much more accurate representation of the ancient faith coming from Jesus and from long before. The cross, in fact, is one of the most ancient and universal of all religious symbols, long predating Christianity, common and widespread. Now, in archaeological remains across the ancient Near East, on down into India, indeed all across the world, archaeologists have unearthed the depictions of the cross in all sorts of cultures. What did it symbolize in those ancient cultures? It certainly didn't symbolize an execution, a crucifixion, because there was no such thing to symbolize in most of those cultures. It symbolized the harmonization of the vertical and the horizontal, the harmonization of the planes beyond this material one and this physical plane down here. It signified the transcendent and the immanent. In other words, it signified God-man and God-woman realized in this human incarnation. It indicated when a state of complete harmony had taken possession of all the being of a living person. So in its ancient forms, the cross was a symbol of spirit incarnated into matter. It represents a key to how the entire universe works. We are dabbling in matter, but are rooted in realms far beyond this one. It's no wonder that in mathematics, the cross became the symbol of addition, or when placed at an angle, that it became the sign of multiplication or progressive forward movement. In paganism and in early Christianity, the cross always symbolized life, never death, which is why early Christianity used it as its symbol, a cross, sometimes with a lamb placed against the cross, but never a crucifix. That is, a cross bearing the body of Jesus crucified on it. In fact, one can note that the first depiction of a God crucified on a cross was the depiction of Orpheus from the 3rd century before Christ. But sad to say, for a very large part of the world's population today, the central religious symbol is a person impaled in agony on that instrument of torture. It's little wonder that such a system should foster the belief that suffering is inevitable or even desirable and good, and horror of horrors, that it could be in some warped way seen as pleasing to God, and thus allow us to become so indifferent to suffering among the masses of humanity. An empty cross symbolizes the descent of spirit into flesh and celebrates the evolution of that life back into its return. The crucifix, by contrast, only idealizes suffering and death. an attitude which ultimately has to be said is not of God. I mean, even Thomas, the twin brother of Jesus, is on record as doing far more miracles than Jesus himself. He raised 19 people from the dead. However, the plot thickens even further when we realize the age at which this occurred in the life of Jesus. In ancient times, as Ramtha has taught, puberty extended out to the age of 32 years. By that time, especially in ancient times, you had married and raised a family. You had worked through all of your stuff. You were ready to move on. You were ready to move on to a much more exalted occupation. By the age of 33, then you were ready to take on in earnest the great work of human evolution, spiritually and materially. Especially when you contemplate the precise time of year when all this occurred. It's striking how many major festivals in all cultures are gathered around the precise day on which this event occurred in the life of Jesus. Obviously, we have Passover in the Jewish tradition. We also have the great festival of the Iranian solar year, Nowruz. We have Maimuna in the Arab world. And of course, after the time of Jesus, we have Easter. Why are all these major festivals grouped around that precise particular time of year? What is this period? It's the spring equinox. Why should that be so special? Well, from the time of the spring equinox onwards into summer at the solstice, the sun is waxing more and more strongly into its full power. In ancient times, it was reckoned to be an enormously propitious time, when the forces of nature were in favour of any new enterprise on which we'd embark, any new beginning, and especially anything to do with a new grade of life and growth and resurrection. We are advised as gardeners to plant when the moon is waxing, not waning. And the ancients advised us to embark on any major endeavour when the sun was waxing. That is, from the equinox of the spring on into the summer solstice in June. The four great festivals of the ancient world, particularly among the Druids, were interspersed between the solstices and the equinoxes. Christianity has replaced all of these pagan festivals with religious equivalents. The statement of Jesus about how easily we see the speck in our brother's eye and fail to see the beam in our own, which is in St. Luke chapter 6, is found also in the teachings of the Buddha. He says, the faults of others are easier to see than one's own. The faults of others are easily seen, but our own faults are hard to see. That's in the Udanavarga, section 27. The admonition of Jesus to do unto others as you would have them do to you is also found in the teachings of the Buddha. Jesus said that whoever looked on a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The Buddha said, commit no adultery. The law is broken by even looking at the wife of another man with lust in the mind. In Hindu, the Lord Krishna says, I am the letter A. I am the beginning and the end. While in the Christian book of Revelation, Jesus the Christ says, I am the Alpha and the Omega.
Both Krishna and Jesus tell their disciples that he will dwell with them and they in him. Jesus says in Luke's Gospel, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. Luke chapter 6. The Buddha gives exactly the same advice in the Hemima Nikaka, verse 21. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. The Buddha said, hatred does not ever cease in this world by hating, but by love. This is an eternal truth. Overcome anger by love. Overcome evil by good. Overcome the miser by giving. Overcome the liar by truth. And Jesus said, just as you did not do it to the least of these, you did not do it to me. Matthew 25. While the Buddha says, if you do not tend one another, then who is there to tend you? Whoever would tend me should tend the sick. The image of the poorly built house is found in both. The emptiness of ritual washings to purify oneself is found in both. And both the Buddha and Jesus were accused of luxurious living because they never practiced a harsh asceticism. Because they knew that what needs to be disciplined in the human being is not the body, but the mind. So it makes no sense to punish the body. Other parables told by Jesus come not from the sayings of the Buddha, but from the Hindu traditions before the time of Jesus, which includes the statement of Jesus that if you had faith like a mustard seed, you could move mountains. Moving mountains is a lingua franca of the great mystery schools. Reminiscent of the wedding at Cana, the Buddha and his disciples were invited to a wedding, and instead of the food being consumed as the guests ate it, it actually grew in quantity and fed the multitude that eventually turned up at the feast. The story of the widow's mite in Mark 12 is replicated in the teachings of the Buddha. In fact, it's replicated so closely that it would be almost impossible to maintain that both stories were independently created. Jesus often spoke disapprovingly of those who had a thirst for miracles, and so did the Buddha. Once, when the Buddha met a yogi who had spent 25 years of intense concentration trying to learn how to walk on water with no tangible result, the Buddha asked him why he had wasted his time on such a small thing, when all he needed was a small coin and the ferryman would have taken him across the river in his boat. Just as the saintly old man Simeon prophesied the birth of the Messiah and held Jesus in his arms as a babe, so the Buddha's birth is prophesied by the saintly old asceta. As Jesus was lost in the temple and was found discoursing with the doctors, so the Buddha wandered away and was lost in contemplation before his family found him again. Both began to preach at the age of 30, and both had 12 disciples. Both called their first disciple when he was sitting under a fig tree. Both had a favorite disciple, and both had one who betrayed him. Need I go on? A.J. Edmonds, for instance, maintains that there are 112 parallels to the Buddha's teaching in the texts of the Christian Gospels. Was this an accident? From another perspective, there are uncanny similarities between the Catholic and the Buddhist and Hindu practices. The rosary, the veneration of relics, ascetical practices, the ceremony of baptism, the ceremony of confession of sins, the celibate clergy, etc. All of these are of Indian origin. There is an uncanny similarity between the fundamental Catholic practices and those of Tibetan Buddhism. The majestic prologue of the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, begins with the statement, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." What do the Vedas say? In the beginning was Brahman, with whom was Vak, or the Word, and the Word was Brahman. A direct quotation from several centuries earlier. The fact of the matter is that most of the teachings of the masters of the early religions belonged first to the various mystery religions in oral form before they were ever committed to writing. In the light of all these similarities between their teachings, is it not tragic that the religions that grew up around their teachings became the heart of the great cultural divide that exists now between East and West, which is one of the foremost and most difficult obstacles that humanity is faced with trying to overcome today. Perhaps the most magnificent discourse of Jesus, in which he encapsulated his entire message, is what we nowadays call the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount, as delivered by Jesus on that grassy hillside beside the Lake of Galilee, does not have a single idea in it that is not paralleled in the Jewish Mishnah or the Talmud. Jesus' standing in the Old Testament tradition is widely accepted by all biblical scholars, of course, without any question. But what is not so widely accepted, if accepted at all, is how much Jesus also stands dead center in other traditions as well as that of Judaism, such as the traditions of the Hermetic books of Egypt. The very title of the seventh book of Hermes is his secret Sermon on the Mount of Regeneration. We can look back at so many things. Francis of Assisi is credited with introducing the ox and the ass into the representation of the crib at Christmas time. Would it surprise you to know that in the Holy of Holies of the great temple at Karnak, there is a depiction of a birth in a stable with angels singing, shepherds visiting, and an ox and an ass? All of this 1700 years before the birth of Jesus. But what is hardly ever recognized is how significantly the teachings of Jesus also parallel other teachings totally from outside the Jewish tradition, especially Eastern traditions. The teachings of the Buddha Gautama and of Christ Jesus were both world subverting. They both taught a way of life that had transformed themselves and which would also bring about a profound transformation in those who followed it. This way of life was far more important than just knowledge. However important knowledge undoubtedly was as a basis. The similarity between Jesus and the Buddha lies mainly in this way with a capital W, this system of behavior that they both advocated as central to everything. This way would open up one to an entirely new way of being, and the teachings only pointed towards that way. They were not the heart of the matter. There are enormous differences between the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha. Jesus was an ardent campaigner for social change in a way that the Buddha never was, in the sense that he stood in the true tradition of the prophets of Israel, who had all campaigned to their peril for deep social change. And yet the systems of teaching of Jesus and the Buddha show uncanny similarities. And needless to say, he never quoted the Buddha by name either. But even if the Buddha by name is never quoted by Jesus, would it surprise you to know that some of the most famous parables of Jesus are also found in the writings of the Buddha, some 550 years before? The famous parable of the sower, found in all three of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, tells of how a sower cast his seed and how it fell on a range of different soils with very different results. The Buddha told it 500 years before. The parable of the treasure in the field is also found in the Buddha's writings. So is the admonition that though heaven and earth should pass away, his words would never pass away. The existence of his twin brother, Jude Thomas, has tried to be exorcised entirely from human history. There is a message even in that fact. When we remember that in the Middle Ages, half of the world's Christians owed their foundation in the faith to the teachings of Thomas, especially as expressed in the Gospel of Thomas, you realize what has happened, because all traces of that Christianity, more than half of all the Christians in the world at that time, has been stamped out, and it has been replaced by the Jesus of Yom Kippur, the suffering person who came to endure torment and death on the cross to appease the vengeance of the savage God of the hamburger universe. The vast majority of the life of Jesus is totally unknown in the Gospels. And when you come to reflect on that, isn't it quite an extraordinary fact that that should be? And you begin to wonder how much political correctness, how much mind control over the people was involved in trying to compress into the miserable molds in which we know him and into which he does not really fit at all. Scripture scholars, of course, will point out that the Gospels were concerned to give only the teachings of Jesus and not his biography. The relevance of the real Jesus for us today is summed up in three major statements that he made, and any of us should take them absolutely seriously who are interested in discovering the real Jesus, as opposed to the sanitized, homogenized, edited version that have turned him into a fable for adoration instead of an ideal to be imitated. I am reminded of the words of Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, when he said, "How well we know what a profitable superstition this fable of Christ has been for us," as he was quoted by John Bale. We are interested in the real Jesus, and the heart of his message is summed up in three great statements. The first one, he said, "Is it not written in your own law that you are all gods?" The reaction of his hearers was to try to stone him for blasphemy, very similar to today. He said, "Why are you trying to stone me? I am merely quoting what's written in your own sacred scripture. It's in Psalm 82. The basic necessary realization is that we are all gods, but that we must bring it into realization. The technology to do that is what we need to learn, not obeying rituals, laws and commandments that do none of this work for us. Now, people find a lot in common, a lot of problems with that, and I can understand it. Why? Because they are thinking of the God of the hamburger universe, the old man with the beard in the clouds with the telescope and the laptop, watching everything we do and getting ready to punish us. Let's leave aside that image. Move to God the Creator, the source of all the galaxies, the stars, and everything that exists on all the planes above this miserable one. Are we that God? Yes. Are we that God now? No. It involves a great process of personal growth, which is the one that Jesus embarked upon So is it then as a result of that process that we become the divine realized in man and woman? Yes. If that were accepted, what a change would come about on the face of the earth today.
Ramtha's teachings, in concert with my lifelong study of many thousands of works in all the main European languages, both modern and ancient, have confirmed to me that the Christian religions do not, as they claim, carry the revelation of a message that was previously unknown. They have assumed their present form through the corruptions of a much more rare but previously existing wisdom that is as old as the foundations of the earth. Christianity could never concede that Jesus owed something to the Buddha or to the Hindus or to the Egyptians in his training, because of the catastrophic implications that would have for the form Christianity had for most of its existence. For if he did owe them something in his training, then Jesus would have to be an ideal for our imitation and could never be seen as the one and only Son of God, or God himself, who was parachuted down from the top floor of the hamburger universe to rescue us all as a suffering Savior. Jesus had nothing whatever to do with appeasing the anger of a savage God. Everything to do with a profound initiation. His triumph showed in a dramatic way what the power of spirit can accomplish in the human body. And it called on all human beings not to imitate the passion, but to bring forth that same spirit of miraculous power, joy, and freedom in their lives.
But it's extraordinary that for a person who has had such an enormous influence over 2 millennia, it's extraordinary that we know so little about himself. We have no idea at all from the Christian New Testament of what he may have looked like. We have no record that he ever wrote anything, though assuredly he must have. But if he did write something, it has not survived. The details of his personal life are few and far between. Most of what we know about him comes from the 4 so-called canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But however undoubtedly important they may be as sources, it is very obvious that they were not interested in providing details of even a rudimentary biography of Jesus. Now, most biblical scholars today would date those 4 Gospels as having been written between the years 60 to 110 AD. However, the earliest manuscripts we have of any of them in a complete sense is from the 4th century, even though a few fragments of them date back to the 2nd century. There are a few references to Jesus from sources outside the New Testament and from outside the so-called Gnostic Gospels and letters. but they are just mentions in passing. Flavius Josephus, the famous Jewish historian who wrote the book called The Antiquities of the Jews, in the early 90s of our era, records the death of James, whom he refers to as the brother of Jesus. Another passage that refers to Jesus is considered by some to be an insertion by early Christians of a later time, or at least something that has been elaborated on by Christians of a later time, because it most certainly would not have come from Josephus himself, who was as far as could be imagined from being a Christian. And our story hinges on a Russian aristocrat called Nicholas Notovich, who published a book in French in 1894 called The Unknown Life of Jesus. Notovich had set out on the great journey at the end of the Russian-Turkish War, about 1878, to explore Eastern Europe and the Middle and the Far East. Notovich reached India, Nepal, Tibet, and Little Tibet, called Ladakh, in the year 1887. Now, Notovich was interested in studying the customs and history of the people and the geography of that magnificent landscape near the Himalayas. He had no interest in religion. I stress that, because I want you to be clear about his motives in going there. Notovich heard many times during his journeys in Tibet that there were scrolls in existence, not just one set, but several sets of scrolls in existence, that spoke of the life of Jesus in India during his teenage years. Notovich eventually arrived at a monastery called Hemis, about 25 miles outside the city of Leh, the capital of Ladakh. He found a monastery. The monastery of Hemis is hidden away in a remote valley at an altitude of more than 11,000 feet above sea level. And its remote location has preserved it from the unwelcome attentions of several conquering armies down the centuries. Notovich claimed that he was shown a copy at Hemis of an ancient Buddhist manuscript which described the life of Jesus from his teenage years up to the age of 26, and that this section of his life had been lived in India and Tibet. Notovich was told that there were scrolls there containing the account of what Jesus did during those years. At first, he wasn't successful in being able to see the scrolls. The lamas were very reticent about showing them to strangers. But as luck would have it, after he had set out on his return journey, he broke his leg, and he had to be taken back to the monastery for emergency treatment. But during his short convalescence there, he became friendly with some of the lamas, and having won their confidence, he was eventually shown the scrolls. Now, according to Notovich, the scrolls were in two large bound volumes written in the Tibetan language. They were translations, not the original, which was in the ancient language of Pali, the language of the Buddha Gautama. He had the scrolls translated for him as one of the lamas read them aloud by Notovich's own Tibetan translator and interpreter. The interpreter rendered them into French. Now, the account of the life of Jesus which Notovich found was scattered throughout the volumes in no particular sequence. Notovich collected the relevant verses together and put them in chronological order, the order that he knew of the life of Jesus. When he came back to Europe, he tried to publish the account of what Jesus was said to have done in India and Tibet and in Kashmir, in those years under the title The Life of Saint Issa, Issa, Best of the Sons of Men. It was a short booklet consisting only of 244 verses. The account in those scrolls was allegedly written down 3 to 4 years after the crucifixion of Jesus and was based on the testimony of merchants from India who had witnessed the event personally. Once Notovich had returned to Europe, the saga that preceded the publication of the material started to emerge. It's very interesting, and it certainly does not seem to be something that would have occurred if the documents had been regarded as a fiction by those who were told about them in Europe. He had been counselled against publishing them by the Archbishop of Kiev. A cardinal in Rome, unfortunately unnamed, who was close to the Pope, Leo XIII, tried to dissuade him from publishing the translation of the scrolls, and the cardinal offered to buy his notes from him if he was short of money. Needless to say, Notovich declined the offer. He was discouraged at Paris by a Cardinal Rotelli. All these names check out. Cardinal Rotelli was not, as you might expect, the Archbishop of Paris, but the nuncio of the Pope in France. He had served previously in a lesser capacity in the Vatican diplomatic service in Constantinople, Istanbul today, where Notovich had previously met him. Cardinal Rotelli said that the Church had suffered enough from hostile criticism already, and asked what would this story do to Christianity if it became public knowledge. It's hardly the reaction of a man who believed the scrolls were fraudulent. In Paris, Notovich next met Monsieur Jules Simon. Simon introduced him to Monsieur Ernest Renan, the great French writer and author of one of the first really great scholarly lives of Jesus. Renan offered to present the writings to the French Academy, but Notovich felt that Renan would get all the credit for the scrolls, while he himself would only be recognized marginally as the one who had found them. So Notovich decided to publish them himself, which he did the year following, after Renan had died. Now, the publication, as you might expect, was a great success. Have you ever heard of these publications before? I certainly hadn't. That says something as well. 8 editions of the book appeared in France within the first year, and 3 English versions appeared in the United States straight away. But in religious terms, Notovich became one of the most hated men in Europe when the work became known, because so much that's contained in that short booklet challenges the bastions of die-hard orthodoxy in so many religions. The attacks began almost immediately. And of course there were allegations made that he had never been in India or in Tibet. Some claimed that Notovich had never visited Hemus Monastery, and they even denied that there was any such place, and therefore obviously no such scrolls. In October 1894, very soon after the publication, Professor Max Müller, Professor of Modern European Languages and Comparative Philology at Oxford University, who had translated the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads first into English, a noted Orientalist, He took up the cudgels against Notovich in an article published in the magazine 19th Century. Muller was convinced that Notovich's Life of Jesus was a fraud. And he didn't even feel certain that Notovich had ever been in Tibet, much less in the monastery of Hemus. Notovich responded fully to Muller's arguments in his preface to the English edition of the Scrolls, which appeared in 1895, the following year. Muller had said, for instance, that this alleged book published by Notovich, if it really had existed, should have been listed in the two great catalogues in which all Tibetan literature is supposed to be entered, the Kanjur and the Tanjur. But Notovich replied that the verses he had published would not be found listed in any catalogue, precisely because they were to be found scattered in many different scrolls and places in the scrolls, interspersed with information on very many other topics, and without any formal title to identify them. Muller also claimed to have received a letter from a lady who had visited the Hemus monastery shortly after the publication of Notovich's book. She said the lamas had told her they had never heard of Notovich, or indeed of any unknown life of Jesus written about in scrolls that were held there at Hemus. Notovich replied that Tibetans had grown wise as a result of unpleasant experiences with Westerners. And when conquering Europeans asked about any literary treasures of the monastery, they rightly suspected that it was because they wanted to take them away with them permanently, and they had suffered such losses in the past. Now, a little background might be interesting here. The renowned Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, who sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and established a trade route between Portugal and the East, he arrived on the east coast of India in the closing years of the 1400s, quote, with an unusual combination of equipment, gunboats and priests. The Pope of the day, who obviously felt it was his right, had divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the East had been allotted to the Portuguese in that division. Now, for the Indians, it was the first outside contact with the teachings of Jesus since Thomas the Apostle had come there a millennium and a half before. Too tragically well aware of the curse of anti-Semitism which plagued Europe for 1500 years and was in large degree due to Christian hostility to Judaism because they blamed it for the crucifixion of the Christ. Come about because of where the blame had been placed for the death of Jesus, how much suffering, how much injustice would have been saved over the centuries if the teachings contained in these Isa scrolls had held sway instead of the familiar Christian tradition of the New Testament. If these scrolls of the life of Jesus in India had never existed, we would still have to ask penetrating questions about a possible acquaintance with Buddhist teaching because of the character of the teachings of Jesus himself. Nobody can deny that the God of the Old Testament is harsh and vindictive, but the God preached by Jesus is of an entirely different kind to the God of the Jewish tradition in which Jesus himself stood. So, has it ever occurred to you to ask, where did this new message that he preached come from? Or was it parachuted directly with him, down from heaven by God, as the devotees of the hamburger universe mindset will maintain? No, there's a much more obvious and less exotic explanation, to which I will return shortly.